Welcome to Unit 12. This is a relatively short unit that's going to look at some of the key aspects of configuring the Web Subsystem. When it comes to the Web Subsystem, there's basically three things that are of interest to administrators. That is the JSP configurations, connectors, including HTTPS connectors or SSL connectors, and virtual servers. So we'll take a look at each of those in turn, starting with JSP. So JSP is short for Java Server Pages. It's a technology that enables essentially web designers to develop web pages in HTML and either themselves or with the assistance of developers, code-based developers, embed some Java code into those HTML pages. These were one of the earlier forms of dynamic pages. JSPs in a production environment are either compiled prior to deployment or, depending on the nature of the deployment, will be compiled automatically by the application server. In either case, during the compilation process, the JSP is converted from what amounts to a HTML page with some embedded Java into the inverted value of that, which is to say a Java source code file with some embedded HTML. This is in fact otherwise known as another Java EE technology, a servlet. So during the compilation phase, we convert a JSP from a JSP into a servlet. So there's code generated and that code is compiled. There are a number of things that are useful and tunable when it comes to JSP configuration on the application server. Most of them are probably more relevant to the development cycle and or the test and QA cycle than production, but there are a couple that in a production environment an administrator may want to pay attention to. So to look at those settings, we would come into the profile section of our management console. We would choose the correct profile, default, full HA, whatever set of profiles our domain.xml file has in it, or of course if we're in standalone then there is only one profile. Down here under Web Servlet, we would then choose the advanced Dropbox here, and you find essentially the three attributes that are most interesting to administrators. The first one is keep generated. As I mentioned, when converting a JSP to a servlet, the code is inverted from a HTML page to a Java page. So keep generated is a request to the application server to keep the Java code that was generated for that page around after the compilation process. This can be useful for debugging and sometimes for finding mistakes. The display source is potentially useful if the source code is available, and that is also dependent on keep generated, if there is a error in processing the JSP page. So the server will attempt to output a snippet of the code that failed at the time of the failure. And the last option is check interval. Check interval is really only relevant if JSPs have been deployed in what's known as an open archive format, where it's possible for yourself as an administrator or some other party to update a JSP page without updating the entire application, so make a modification to the page without modifying the entire application. and the check interval allows the application server to periodically check to see whether a JSP has in fact changed, and if it has, to reconvert it from HTML to Java and recompile it. So that happens dynamically. Historically, in production environments, you often find that the server does a form of pre-compilation, and so the check interval is often not required. To modify these changes, to modify these settings, you would click the edit button. Check or uncheck as appropriate, and in fact the default is turned on. The likely value that you want is unchecked. All it's doing is taking up disk space if you do keep it. If you make a change, you'll need to save it, of course, and generally speaking, if you make a change to the settings here, I haven't strictly speaking made a change, but if you make a change to the settings, it's a change that will require you to reload the server. In other words, to stop and restart the server so that the server configuration can be reread. It's not a dynamic change to a running instance. You'll typically get a message up here to indicate that, and of course you could restart the server via the runtime environment runtime tab. That's pretty much all there is in terms of JSP configuration. So our next area of interest is configuring connectors. Connectors are the mechanism by which clients interact with your server. These are of course web clients, and so broadly speaking, connectors fall into one of three categories: the HTTP connector, or the standard HTTP protocol, the SSL version of that, HTTPS, or if you're using some form of front-end load balancing technology, then you're quite possibly using the AJP protocol, which is the Apache JServe protocol. So these, generally speaking, are the three primary types of connectors that you're likely to be enabling for the web subsystem. To work with connectors, you can see the connectors tab here on the same places we were looking at for the JSPs a few moments ago. There's one currently defined within here. We can make changes to this if we wish to do so, or we can add additional connectors if we'd like to. There's one little gotcha with creating a connector though, and that's this, the socket binding. You can't create a connector without nominating an appropriate socket binding, so you may need to, before establishing or creating a new connector, refer to the socket binding section here to identify an appropriate socket binding name. This is what you're going to have to populate in that socket binding field. So identify an appropriate socket binding name with which to associate with the connector, which may of course also mean that you need to create a new socket binding if there isn't a suitable socket binding already in place. So if we go back to the connector here for a second, we could add a new connector by giving it a name. My connector, for instance, we might want to make this an SSL style connector. You can see the socket binding. This is sort of dynamically looking up, but it's best to make sure that you have prior knowledge of what socket bindings exist. But select an appropriate socket binding. The protocol. Your protocol consists of either HTTP or AJP. If I'm setting up the HTTPS, I'm going to be using HTTP, of course, and if I'm using HTTP, then I need to nominate whether it's vanilla HTTP or the SSL version of it. The enabled checkbox basically determines whether the connector will be started when the server starts. It's not going to necessarily enable it straight away. We can save that, and we now have a connector available to us. For the HTTP, for the SSL functionality, we would additionally have to use the command line interface to define the certificate details. So there's additional configuration required when it comes to SSL, and in fact your lab exercise for this module is to set up SSL, and it quite clearly steps you through the process of making the CLI adjustments, and in fact it does a quick certificate generation. The process of generating a SSL certificate and getting it signed and so forth is beyond the scope of this course, but in the lab exercise you will actually generate a self-signed certificate that will be populated into a key store, and then using the command line interface that will be added to the connector so that you are able to access your server instance over a secure SSL connection. Not so secure because it's self-signed, but it'll give you the idea of how to set it. So we're going to finish off our tour of the Web Subsystem by talking about virtual servers. The concept of virtual servers is pretty simple. The application server effectively responds to more than one host name for web-based clients, so visitors to your websites. By that we mean you could register multiple host names against a virtual server, and those host names would be served by the one server instance, or in the case of a cluster, the cluster. This gives the appearance to external parties that there is multiple servers, when in fact it's just one server, or as I say, possibly the cluster. Any application you deploy to the virtual hosts will effectively be available against each of the aliases. To set up a virtual server in essentially the same location that we've been in for the last couple of sections, so profiles, appropriate profile instance, web servlet, virtual servers, you can see that there's a default host in there already. It comes shipped with the configuration files, and it's pointing to localhost and example.com. Probably not particularly useful in a production environment, so you can either choose to edit this one or add your own and remove this one. In fact, you can have multiple virtual hosts as well. So we will demonstrate adding one. Give it a name. Choose some appropriate host names that you plan to expose, bearing in mind that host names will need to resolve to the IP address of the server. So both redhat.com and jboss.com in my example here would potentially need to resolve to whatever the IP address was of the server that I'm end up using to deploy. The last thing we need to set up is the default module. This is essentially the default web app that will be served up in the event that your site visitor doesn't nominate the application as part of the URL. As you're probably aware, when accessing a deployed web application, you normally nominate the web application name as part of the URL. Obviously a lot of visitors to sites just hit the host name without a URL application name provided. So if you don't have one nominated, or it's not set up correctly, then the standard EAP6 welcome page would appear, which is probably not what you want. As an aside, if you do set one up here, and we've been using example in several previous previous exercises, if you do set one up here, it will modify a property that's typically only accessible via the command line interface, a property called enable welcome route. It will set that to false. That is the boolean that enables or disables the standard welcome page. So if we save that, you can see the virtual host is registered here with its name, its aliases, and its default module registered. That's pretty much all there is to it, but what we'll do quickly now is just take a quick look at the effect that those changes have had on our web subsystem. So I'm looking at the default profile here. Here is the web subsystem, and you can see the JSP configuration setting here. You can see the My Connector that has the socket binding on it, and of course you can see the virtual host that we've just set up. Alright, the last thing you have to do for this module, for this unit, is the lab exercise, which steps you through setting up SSL on the server. Good luck.